Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm Ali Aslan, international TV presenter and journalist, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this upcoming session now titled, How Can a Revolution Succeed?, where we will focus on the legacy and perhaps more importantly, the lessons of the Arab Spring. And I have a superb panel with me to discuss this very intricate issue with the next 45 minutes in alphabetical order. Here with me in the studio is Daniel Gerlach. He's the editor-in-chief of the prominent German Middle East magazine Zenit and the director general of the Berlin-based think tank Candid Foundation. Delighted to welcome from Beirut the Dutch-Lebanese journalist and best-selling author Kim Gattas. After 20 years at the BBC, she's now a contributing writer at The Atlantic magazine and a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Also joining us from Beirut, Lebanon, is the award-winning Lebanese author, publisher, journalist, and women's rights activist Joumana Haddad. She's been named, among others, as one of the world's 100 most powerful Arab women for her cultural and social activism. And last but certainly not least, delighted to welcome from Tunis, the Tunisian singer-songwriter Amal Matlouti. She rose to fame with her protest song Kelmti Ora, My Word is Free, which became an anthem for the Tunisian revolution and indeed the entire Arab Spring. Welcome to you all. Wonderful to have you. And Amal, let's start with you. You are based in Tunis, in Tunisia, where the Arab Spring had its origin 10 years ago. You became famous and known as the voice of this Arab Spring. Looking back 10 years later, what memories do you still have from those days?
It's a great question to start with. Well, I can only have great memories because I feel that's the time where we all really felt great hope and utopia, and we were all very connected and very united. It was scary at times, but I think we will never have a time as charged emotionally, in a time where we really all agreed for a minute. So I will always be nostalgic to that time, and it is also a time where we felt like everything was possible. But also, it's also a time where we always have to remember, because it's a time that we need to be inspired ourselves right now as we're still trying, and the next generations as well.
Indeed, great euphoria, a very exciting time indeed, historic, no doubt. But Kim, there are many who say that as groundbreaking as this period was, it probably or perhaps did more harm than good. Some analysts point towards the Syrian war, of course, which has claimed 500,000 lives. They point towards Yemen and Libya. Both countries are in the midst of a civil war. They point towards Egypt, where President Sisi perhaps rules with an even tougher grip than his predecessor, Mubarak. Looking back, did the Arab Spring do more harm than good?
I think that it was inevitable that these systems that were in place, that were oppressive for men and women alike, for young and old alike, would eventually collapse, and not necessarily in an orderly fashion. And so I don't think that we can dismiss the Arab uprisings as events that did more harm than good, because in fact, dictatorships also do a lot of harm. And I think it's very hard to ask those who rose up in protest against this oppression in Syria whether they regret it. It's a really difficult question to ask people in Yemen. Some might yearn back for the stability of a dictatorship. Some people in Iraq do as well. But overall, the movement forward towards more freedom, more rule of law, more human rights is an inevitable one. And I think that what we're seeing is a process that began with the revolutions and is continuing today. So the cost has been very high. The cost of dictatorship is also very high. You could argue that it's the dictator's fault that this is where we are today, including with how the revolutions unfolded. But today, I very much see a process still unfolding in the region with a new generation of protesters. I call them the class of 2019 as opposed to the class of 2011. They've learned from the class of 2011. They realize that only calling for the fall of the regime isn't going to help build a state. And I see them calling for reforms, for governance, for rule of law, and I see them organizing politically. But unfortunately, I also see them being killed and hunted by dictatorships or militias, like in Iraq and in Lebanon, or dictatorships in Egypt, that still fear any alternative to this oppressive rule that they present.
And indeed, Kim Gattas is saying the Arab Spring was not a failure. As a matter of fact, it is an ongoing process. And Jumana, indeed, if we look at some of the countries, Algeria, Lebanon, your own country, of course, Sudan, Iraq, where we've seen a string of protests throughout the years, you think those are the continuation, what started in Tunisia 10 years ago?
Yes, indeed. Well, I personally think that the 2011 revolutions were indeed disastrous and bloody for the countries that where they took place, and that with the exception of the positive example of Tunisia, where the spark of revolt had ignited, the so-called spring has brought a dreadful winter upon us, whether on the level of democracy or safety or economic situation or social justice. But just like Kim so rightfully said, I'm sure that many people, if those people were asked, they would do it all over again. You cannot stop a volcano from erupting. Now, 2019, the class of 2019 is witnessing another wave of revolution, and we can only hope that we have learned the lesson taught to us by the first wave, and that we will keep pushing to prevent a new monster from replacing the old monster, instead of these protests leading to a real change and paving the road for freedom, dignity, and democracy in the Arab world. People need to, I understand the frustration of people. They feel like, for example, even in Lebanon, people feel in a way helpless because the nationwide protests of October 17 seem to have failed to achieve their goals. And I understand them because even if we have managed to bring down two cabinets, two successive governments, yet the same corrupt political faces are still there with some new names who are mere masks for the old names, and the economic meltdown is getting worse by the minute, and we have witnessed an explosion that has destroyed our capital, not to mention the coronavirus pandemic. But people need to accept that change requires time, especially the kind of drastic change that is needed in Lebanon. It's a systematic change that we need. And this kind of change is a buildup, and it is made over years and generations. It's not like we're going to wake up one day and see them gone. I so wish we could, but it's not going to happen. So we need to keep pushing.
We need to keep pushing. Systematic change is not going to come quickly or easily, says Jumana Haddad. Daniel Gela, you know the region very well. You travel extensively in the region. If we look at the numbers 10 years on, you have more oppression, you have more economic problems, you have more people imprisoned for their political beliefs in the Middle East than before the Arab Spring. Nonetheless, we heard these three remarkable women strike a rather optimistic tone, say, no, something good came out of it. Would you agree? What positive changes did the Arab Spring bring?
I totally agree, and I would very much subscribe to what Kim said about the legitimacy of asking people on the street 10 years later, do you regret having done this Arab Spring or having started this historical event? The Arab Spring is not a football club. We don't count goals. We don't count like which way are you going, what did you fail or did you succeed. The Arab Spring is a historical event that is far from being over. So we are probably, I don't want to give another football analogy, but we are probably in the halftime, optimistically said. And it's as complex as it is and as diverse as it is. Of course, we as journalists, analysts, experts, we want to summarize. Okay, we want to see it as one Arab phenomenon, but we have to look at the diversity. I can tell you that from my personal experience, the narrative of absolute power has changed. Before 2011, in the Middle East community, if I may care to call it so, there was this feeling that these rulers are going to rule forever. We had a change of guard in the dynasties, let's say, at the beginning of the millennium. But people very much believe that these dynasties are going to rule on and on and on. And once, I don't know, like the son of Hosni Mubarak, who at that time was an interesting pretendant to take over, or the son of Hafez al-Assad, who effectively took over, these people would rule, until they die in office. And the Arab Spring has brought forward, I think, a certain conscience that absolute power or eternal power is an illusion. And even the harshest rulers and even the most self-confident rulers today, I think, know that their term can be over tomorrow. Legitimately, legally, democratically, violently, but power is something that is given to you or that you take, but you might lose it rather quickly. Then I see another positive event, which is in the civil society. Of course, the flood of bad news about political instability and terrorism and security concerns and mass migration, economic crisis, totally divert our attention from the fact that the civil society is there. In 2011, I wrote an op-ed in which I said, Arab societies may now enjoy the sympathy of the world, but they will be left alone quite soon. There's no illusion, they will have to deal with this. And I think like in many Arab countries, the society and elements of society are quite astonishingly resilient and creative. And if I look at young people, at the attitudes, at the opinions that I hear from young people in the Arab world, I find it much more mature, much more focused, much more interested also in political affairs than 10 years ago. And maybe I met different people by now, but I think I can call this, though I don't have any statistical facts or evidence for it, from my very personal experience, this is the case.
The impressions certainly speak towards positive changes in the region. It's only halftime. Says Daniel Gela, so another 45 minutes to pick up the football analogy to go. A lot can be decided. Amal, let's look at the case of Tunisia again, the country where it all began, obviously the country where you are based. Tunisia has often been perceived as the country where democracy has survived, where democracy has established itself. But even there, we are seeing new protests, frustration, and a growing nostalgia, if you will, for President Ben Ali. How disillusioned are the people, particularly the young people in your country?
Well, I think what basically happened is that we removed a dictator and then we replaced him by people who we voted for democratically, but who actually are quite more corrupt. So the problem, it's not in the revolution itself. The problem is that there are some people who are not willing to give power. Some people are not willing to let the young generation take over, to let Tunisia become a democratic country. So as long as there's going to be corruption, there's absolutely no way for any revolution or any civil movement to succeed. And that's where we're at in Tunisia right now. So in getting rid of Ben Ali, we replaced him with a system that's giving the impression of a democracy, because we do have democratic votes, but I think like the people in the government are now we don't even know who's doing the stealing, because during the time of Ben Ali, there were the clan and the mafia that of the Trabelsis, but now it's like, you know, so so many behind the scenes happening. Also, I disagree with the fact that the revolution are the things that didn't succeed and therefore brought darkness and brought chaos, because Ben Ali is only a human and he was getting sick towards the end, and he was not immortal. So even though at the at the cost of freedom and we have economic stability, that was not going to continue, because well, the problem why Ben Ali happened is because Bourguiba before him never wanted to let go of the power. And if Bourguiba, who did a lot of good things but also made a lot of bad things happen, if he had left a lot of opponents on the scene and worked with them, he executed a lot of them. So in the end, it gave birth to a coup by a new dictator that was much worse. So I think the problem resides in when one person just takes over and then tortures and removes anybody else who could bring ideas, who could bring initiatives so that the countries thrive. And this is what's happening now. It's the same systematic, so it's very hopeful to see the young, like I think Kim said, the class of 2019. I mean, those who were children when the revolution happened, I'm very in touch with them, and because I'm a musician, so I feel like people they are in this place where they're very much informed than us. They're much more connected. They're much more eclectic. They are they're very into culture, into the arts, and they have much stronger ideas, and they're not scared, and they do not care, and they want their rights to be acknowledged, and they want their country to be the country where they dream, where they're heard, where their ideas can happen. So the problem is that we have to get rid of all the corrupt class.
Absolutely, the young generation key here for certain. Before I go to Kim and then Jumana, Daniel, you wanted to quickly respond to what Amal was saying.
A comment to Amal. Of course, she's living in the country I don't, so I can understand that you have a much more gloomy and probably also a much more disillusioned perspective on this. But I think what happened in Tunisia politically is remarkable. 2 years after the revolution, can discuss if what happened was really a revolution, but 2 years after Ben Ali had left, the country was in a situation which could have ended up in dramatic political violence. And I think Tunisians proved their corruption aside, their political maturity, and their common sense, and the fact that they wanted to solve this crisis and bring people together at a very critical moment, which could have become a disaster. It could have become a civil war even. So I think today, yes, there is nostalgia for the good old days. There is even a political party leader who openly publicly regrets Ben Ali's time, and she kind of wants to return. She might even become Tunisia's president, though she represents a party which has nothing but contempt for the young Tunisian democracy. But nevertheless, I think the situation today is probably more comparable to southern European Mediterranean democracies like Greece. We have the discourse in Greece, in the Western Balkans, in Italy, in Spain, and I think Tunisia is now much closer to that kind of political discourse, and populism is a big part of it. Complaints about corruption and inefficiency of the government institutions is all part of it. But I think it's much more closer to that than to the discourse in many other countries of the Arab world. And I think we should bear this in mind, and that's why I think Tunisia has moved much closer to Europe, not only for its own benefit, but it's as a matter of fact.
Certainly, the Pandora's box has.
If I may,
just quickly, please, because
yeah.
I want to bring in Kim and Jumana. Just one sentence. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, of course, we didn't sink in chaos, but And of course, I'm the first person to not be nostalgic at all for any reasons for the times of before. And the fact of the matter is we have an extraordinary freedom of press that would have never happened before. And but I still think that we could do much better. And also, Tunisia has
Right.
always been a much more balanced country. We don't have huge resources, so therefore, the foreign interest is not as hard as for countries like Syria.
Right.
So we have
I
to bear that in mind a little bit.
I think it's very clear that the jury's still out on how this is going to end. Certainly a very ongoing dynamic process, very much the same in Lebanon, of course, Kim, where you are based. The country has been going through very tough times, emblematic by this very traumatic explosion that your country has witnessed last year. By and large, what do you think is the main lesson? What do you think are the main lessons from the Arab Spring that countries like yours can derive strength and optimism from?
Well, I think there are also some lessons for the West, actually, and they're very important. And the lesson is that they should also not have nostalgia for dictators, because the dictators brought stability, which suited Western interests, but they put a lid on all the problems. And when the lid came off, it became terrible and bloody for everyone. And it became a problem for the West. And we've heard all the complaints about refugees going to Europe in their thousands, hundreds of thousands, and the few tens of thousands of refugees who make it to the US. So I think the West needs to look at this conundrum of stability from a very different perspective and try to see what can bring stability that benefits not just the West and its interests, but a durable stability for the region, which in the long term is in everyone's interest. So they should look at it from a pragmatic perspective. If we can support those who want rule of law and governance in their own countries, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Sudan, those who are fighting against corruption, against sectarianism, that has benefits for us in the region, that allows us to live free and with justice and decency and human rights in our own countries. And that makes us and our governments better partners, durable partners for us as citizens and for Western countries. So if the West wants to look at it only from a purely interest aspect for itself, it should want this for us as well. It should want us to want to stay in our own countries because we are thriving, and no one really chooses to be a refugee. That is not our choice.
Very, very valuable lessons for Europe to learn as well, quite indeed. Jumana, you are a very prominent women's rights activist, known worldwide, and women have been taking a leading role throughout this process, throughout the Arab Spring. Speaking to women across the region, what gives you hope? Where do you see the basis for women once again to take over and take the helm of the next revolution?
Okay, but allow me before answering this question to comment briefly on the international community, since it has been mentioned by both Kim and Daniel and Amal. I do believe we have to talk about the international role in all this. We cannot discuss the revolutions without talking about the role that foreign powers have played in it, not to undermine the power of the people and their self-determination. I do not doubt that one bit. But if we take the example of Syria, for example, after all the horrendous things that a dictator like Bashar al-Assad has done to his people, to not have him tried in the International Court of Justice for crimes of war, and to see how economic interests are now dictating the way that the global community and foreign powers and European powers are dealing with him, is disheartening, not to say revolting. And now he is going to run for elections again, and obviously, and he is going to win with 99% of the votes, like he always does, and like his father did before him. Talking about, I just wanted to say this, talking about the role of women in revolutions, in all the revolutions, whether in 2011 or in 2019, women were on the forefront of these revolutions. They have been demonstrating on the streets. They have faced everything. Let me talk about the example of Lebanon, from the brutality of police forces to their tear gas bombs, to their rubber bullets, to the threats and sticks of Amal and Hezbollah cohorts, to the outrageous insolence of people on the streets. But they kept going down and taking up the street and demonstrating, because this revolution and these revolutions are also and foremost feminist revolutions. Feminism means dignity. It means equality and rights for each and every person. And as much as we need to fight for our economy and we need to fight corruption that is widespread in our countries, we also need to fight for human rights. We need to fight for our human dignity, because without these, there is no real revolution. And I see many examples of strong, powerful women around me that are doing their best to keep pushing the envelope and to keep fighting for themselves, for their rights, for their country. And now what is most awaited are the elections next year in Lebanon. And we hope, because that's where also the change should translate, we hope for more women in politics in Lebanon, for more women in politics all over the Arab world, because we need to have more women. Even in Europe, you don't have enough women in politics. So we need to push for that. We need to have women in decision-making positions in order for this world to change for the better. This is my conviction.
And you, Kim and Amal, obviously stands for the role of strong women, are perfect and splendid examples of the change that women can bring to the region. Before I move on with Dania, let me just, Kim, just quickly one question concerning the role of the international community, role of the West, quote unquote, which you and Jumana have rightly criticized. Now we have a new administration in Washington. Joe Biden is the new president, and it's an administration that, at least on the surface, is trying to put human rights on the very forefront of its foreign policy. How optimistic are you that this president can bring the change in your region, in the Middle East, in North Africa, the change that we have been talking about for the past 30 minutes?
I don't think it's up to the Biden administration to bring the change. It's up to us to make it happen. And it's up to the Biden administration to see how their policies need to adapt to the aspirations of the people of this region. They're saying all the right things. They're talking about human rights. They're talking about freedom, democracies. They're talking about fighting corruption. And they have a better understanding today in their own country of the fragility of democracy. Let's not forget that just a few months ago, on January 6th, there was an insurrection on Capitol Hill within the walls of Congress. And so it should be a lesson for the United States that when it calls for justice within the United States so that it can lead to real stability, that should be the lesson, that anywhere, if you don't have justice, you cannot have stability. Now, I'm not naive. I understand realpolitik. I understand that the United States has interests, but of all the different superpowers, whatever the criticism is of the US, it does still stand out as the one that talks about values. You know, the Russians don't, the Chinese don't, the Iranians certainly don't. The Americans still have that, and people do look to the United States for support when it comes to human rights and democracy. And so the United States has an opportunity to reframe how it looks at the region and support in the best ways that it can, not individual protesters, not individuals, firebrand figures, but a movement for civil rights, just like they have in the US. Black Lives Matter. Our lives matter in this region as well. And I am hopeful that they're looking to find this way for a better balance. And they're very focused on concepts like governance, rule of law, and the fight against corruption. And in that, they have a partner in the Arab people.
Daniel, I want to pick up on this particular point. You are a German, a European, but someone who knows the Middle East, someone who knows North Africa, someone who travels extensively in the region. The criticism that has been directed towards the so-called West, the international community, for its role that it has played, is the criticism justified?
Yes, though I don't agree with Jumana that this is necessarily out of pure economic interest, the deadlock, the inability to solve conflict. What happened in parallel, and there is a correlation between the two, between the Arab Spring and the so-called Westlessness, which means like the dissolution of the concept of the West, the dissolution of the Western Alliance, the disintegration of the Western Alliance, and of course the rise of other regional and global powers that found a very inexpensive opportunity to project power in the region, like for example Turkey and Russia. So when we talk about the West and about Europe, we have to bear in mind that it's very much a question to what extent there still is a West and there still is a joint European action or even a joint European interest. The deadlock in Syria is not necessarily, or the behavior of the Western powers is not out of economic considerations. Maybe if you consider migration policies a part of foreign economic policies or domestic stability policies or whatever, that's an argument to make, but I don't think it's because of economic interest. The region has probably triggered developments that we're not even aware of. We can argue that probably Brexit, one of the heaviest, let's say, losses and one of the most like shattering experience for the European Union, might have been a consequence of the Arab Spring, because the disintegration of the international order, the general feeling of insecurity, the mass migration and the way that populist politicians exploited this was triggered by the Arab Spring. You can even argue that the rise of Russia on the global level and the way it benefited from the vacuum in the Arab world, which it commands masterly, and the rise of the Trump administration at the same time, might have been an indirect consequence of the Arab Spring. The creation of Daesh, of the so-called Islamic State, statelet, is of course a much more direct consequence of the Arab Spring, though others argue that it's a rather like long-term consequence of the American invasion in Iraq. But the way that the Arab Spring has changed, and I'm not talking about demonstrations, protests, revolutions that happened elsewhere in the world, the way that authoritarian rulers respond to these challenges, be it in Venezuela, be it in several Asian countries, probably even in Russia, are all based on the experience of what they have seen and what has caught them by surprise in North Africa and the Middle East. So whatever we say about this region, and whatever you say about it, the opposite is also true, which is like my experience. Whatever we say about this region, no one can argue that this region is not relevant. It's not relevant for our security, it's not relevant for the global order. And that's a lesson that the Arab Spring has taught, I think, everyone who's dealing with this. And I'm sure that the previous panelists who are more like into the like international diplomacy and power games would totally agree to that.
Well, certainly everything is connected with everything.
Well,
Jumana, go ahead. Let me just point out, just quickly. Let me just point out we have approximately 10 minutes left. So Jumana and Kim, go ahead.
And we still have to discuss if a revolution can succeed or not.
Oh, of course, we'll get to that.
I would like to point out to Mr. Daniel, because he said that it's not necessarily economic interests that are in play when Europe and the United States decide their policies in the region. I would like to remind him that of Iran and KSA. Obviously, you must know, Mr. Daniel, that these two countries aren't champions in human rights. But you also know that both the US and many European countries, amongst which Germany, France, and others, have close economic relationships with these two countries. And now, for example, just to give one example, since we spoke about Biden's government and human rights, now they are talking about being open to ease sanctions on Iran, a country that violates human rights in its sheer existence, in the way it treats its citizens daily. So I don't think we can really sanctify these relationships. We all know that there's a lot of money at stake, and that money dictates a lot of policies in the West.
Right. Kim, let me ask you, since we are doing the final rounds now, being mindful of the limited time that we have, the session is titled, How Can a Revolution Succeed? Implying, of course, that the first round, the Arab Spring 10 years ago, did not succeed, even though you all pointed out this is an ongoing process. What must change? What has to be different? What dynamics have to come into play for the next so-called revolution to succeed in your region?
Well, I would shy away from the word revolution, and I would stick to civil rights movement towards governance, towards rule of law, and against corruption, more inclusive systems, better participation. I think that what we need to see is in parallel, young generation of this region working hard to accept and work on the fact that activism alone is not enough. They must get into politics. The revolutionaries of 2019 shied away from politics because it's a dirty game in this region. No one wants to be a politician, son of, brother of, friend of, acquiescing to the abuses of dictators or militias or corrupt rulers, etc. But activism alone and revolutions alone are not going to change the system. And so we should encourage the young generation to participate, to fight for elections on this basis of rule of law, governance, anti-corruption, and so on. They might succeed, they might fail, but they have to try again, and we have to encourage them. And we have to stop describing politics as something that, if you have any decency, you shouldn't participate in. We have to change the system, not only from the outside, but also from the inside. And in parallel, I'm somewhere between Jumana and Daniel on the issue of economic interests and stability. I understand the interests of international countries. I understand the need to make sure Iran doesn't get a nuclear program developed towards the possibility of a weapon. A lot of people are very worried about the lifting of sanctions, but that was the deal made in 2015. So if Iran complies with the nuclear aspect of it, the West will have to comply with the lifting of sanctions. But you can put safeguards onto how you lift those sanctions to make sure that the money doesn't flow in one direction or another that would make the problem worse. And just to wrap up, because I know we're short on time, it's also essential for the West, as I've said, and as several of us have pointed out already, to understand that this is a process and that you cannot remove a dictator and suddenly have a ready-made alternative. Because these dictators and these systems have disabled the ability to build politics, to have a political culture, to even know how to run for elections. It's not that we don't know how to, it's that we don't have the experience because it's not been allowed for us to do that. And so the West cannot expect to have a ready-made alternative. And I think that is a terrible question that they kept asking during the Arab uprisings. Oh, well, Bashar al-Assad, well, what's the alternative? You know what the answer was very often? The alternative is dead or in jail, because these dictators are very good at hunting down anyone who can be a credible alternative. And that is the only thing to which I don't have an answer. How do you protect those who want to run for politics, who get assassinated in the process? But it comes again up to the West to insist on accountability, right, and an end to impunity in this region.
But for sure, the young people have to get involved, have to get into politics. Amal, I'm sure Kim's words certainly sound resoundingly true. from where you are in Tunisia, where the young people have just gone on the streets once again to protest against the excessive youth unemployment. The frustration is very real. So the lessons that have been learned in this ongoing process, the young have to get involved, have to get into politics, run for office. Is that also your understanding looking forward?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in the example of Tunisia, I'm seeing. I mean, it's incredible. I'm extremely proud. I've been seeing like young people going in the streets and asking for all kinds they have all kinds of demands. You know, freedom of rights. You know, LGBT community, and we haven't seen any of this. You know. A few years ago. So everything is changing, and that gives me a lot of hope. But at the same time, a general observation: a revolution can't succeed on its own. A system can't change while being isolated. If we have dictatorships surrounding in Libya and in Algeria, how can a revolution succeed? So it's basically the question sometimes can be just summed up. I mean, if we're living in a world regimented by capitalism, how can we have fair systems? How can we have fair relationships and reach equality? So to me, I feel like we can raise better generations for sure, and have them be conscious about being involved in politics, but even beyond that, because in Tunisia, I feel a lot of generations have been raised without even being allowed to think. Even thinking was a crime. So therefore, I feel like my generation has been a generation of fear. Even we couldn't really decide for our future. Now, even though still the same problems exist in the education system, or even I feel like the education system is not getting any better.
Right.
And I won't even mention culture or the arts, because a lot of people are completely hopeless and clueless. I feel like nobody is putting culture at the front of their program, and that will raise more fully formed humans and young generations who are informed and aware of everything around them. So
Yeah,
I feel like there's still hope, a lot of hope, especially after what just happened. But I think the work has to be done a little bit everywhere.
Absolutely. Everybody has to chip in. Everybody has to play his or her part. I think that is for sure. Jumana and Daniel, before we wrap up, same question to you, of course. I think it's become abundantly clear there's no one size fits all. Lebanon's problem might differ from those in Tunisia, Iraq, Sudan, Egypt, you name it. Nonetheless, the question been posed to both Kim and Amal, also to you. How can a revolution, or another term as Kim would have it, succeed? How can a transformation, perhaps a better term, succeed?
Well, I do like the word revolution. I don't mind it. I do feel it was a revolution that took us by surprise because we were not expecting it. We had reached a point of hopelessness just before that day. But listen, since October 17, 2019, we have managed to prove the strength of people's wills and their demands for change, as well as the vulnerability of the country's ruling elite. We have yet to succeed in raising up alternative leadership. And now new political parties and coalitions are being formed as a sign of what lies ahead. And this is why I and many others are hopeful. One important indication for that there is reason for hope, and it's not merely a Don Quixotean attitude, is how the young generations who were struggling in this hopeless place called Lebanon, feeling that it was a lost cause and that nothing will ever change, are now invested in this. So the revolution is still ongoing, but it has taken a different necessary form, that of political activism or political action, and we need to succeed on that level in order to move forward.
Dania Gela, listening to these three remarkable women, I do hear hope. I do sense hope despite the hardship, despite the difficulties that they've encountered in the region. Your recipe for how a revolution, transformation, whatever you term, do you have a third term that you want to throw in the mix?
I don't have a recipe. I just think that a revolution can succeed if at one point a critical mass of the people and a critical mass of the institutions of the state somehow work together. That happened in Tunisia. The next day after the departure of Ben Ali, the institutions worked on. That's why many people doubt that actually what happened was an institution, was a revolution, because the state continued to function. In Egypt, we have a different scenario. If we look at the forces that were moved into the field against change, then I think the balance is pretty positive. I think the civil society remarkably succeeded if we see what they were fighting against. I think history is very often seen as an interplay of wars and revolution. This is the way how we as historians, as political analysts, as journalists discuss history. Let's make sure we don't miss what's happening in between.
Well, I think to pick up Daniel's football analogy, unfortunately this match is done, but the match called the Arab Spring certainly is very much ongoing. I hear optimism. I hear optimism throughout this process, an ongoing process to think and speak of the Arab Spring as a finished product is wrong. This is what I've gotten from this conversation. Quite on the contrary, it's a continued process. Amal Matlouti, Jumana Haddad, Kim Gattas, and Dania Gela, thank you so much for your input. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for clarifying and putting new perspectives on the phenomenon called the Arab Spring 10 years on.